everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Nights into Dreams, a three-dimensional action title developed by Sonic Team and published by Sega and released for the Sega Saturn back in 1996. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 94. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, and Wendell Jr. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broad game-playing population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Nights into Dreams. NiGHTS Into Dreams is a three-dimensional action title developed by Sonic Team and published by Sega for the Sega Saturn back in 1996. Before we can talk about NiGHTS Into Dreams, we need to take a step back and talk about the game's creators, Sonic Team, and by extension, the development of the game's home console platform, the Sega Saturn, a release that in the eyes of many signaled the beginning of Sega's downfall as a video game hardware manufacturer. First though, let's take a look at Sonic Team, the division of Sega that was formed in 1990 and was focused on, as you might expect, bringing the titular Sonic the Hedgehog to life on Sega's latest home console, the Sega Genesis. Longtime listeners may recall that we had an episode devoted exclusively to the original Sonic the Hedgehog, released nearly a year ago, so I'm not going to rehash all of the history behind that franchise's creation here. To provide a brief refresher though, Sonic the Hedgehog was primarily the brainchild of two Sega employees, talented programmer Yuji Naka and visionary artist Naoto Oshima. Between Naka's innate ability to create gameplay mechanics and technologies that had previously been unheard of, like a ridiculous sense of speed and curving, looping, and otherwise non-linear stages for players to traverse, and Oshima's talents in designing characters that appealed to a wide range of players and demographics, the duo joined forces to create a game that would, for the first time in years, push a console manufacturer other than Nintendo to the top of the home video game market. As part of the often discussed console wars, the creation of Sonic the Hedgehog represented a huge haymaker delivered to Sega's closest competitor, Nintendo. And while Nintendo wouldn't quite be put down for the count, it certainly was dazed against the ropes, as the Sega Genesis captured a ton of market share and became, for many teenagers across the world, the cool console to own, with the most mature, edgy content only being available on Sega's platform, while Nintendo? Well, that was for the preschoolers and toddlers to enjoy. If you were a man, or a woman, or more accurately, a teenager pretending to be more mature than their age, the Sega Genesis was the console that proved you were more hip than your peers. Obviously, this wasn't even close to being true, but perception can sometimes become reality, and that belief, amongst other things, is what drove Sega to outperform Nintendo for a couple years in the early 1990s, and a huge portion of that success was driven by Sonic the Hedgehog. As you might imagine, with a title as successful as Sonic the Hedgehog, it would be silly to not begin working on a sequel, and as most are likely aware, there would be many sequels in the Sonic franchise over the years. Most interesting to our discussion today are the immediate successors to Sonic the Hedgehog, namely Sonic the Hedgehog 2, 3, Sonic & Knuckles, and Sonic CD, a series of titles that were all released between 1992 and 1994. The first three games I mentioned, Sonic 2, 3, and Sonic & Knuckles, were all the result of a collaboration between a core group of Japanese Sonic game developers, including Yuji Naka, along with the relatively newly formed Sega Technical Institute, or STI, Sega's American development studio led by video game industry veteran Mark Cerny. STI was envisioned as a way to combine Sega's video game design know-how with a more well-established understanding of American culture, a market that Sega was continuously trying to capture. In fact, with the first Sonic the Hedgehog, one of the company's primary design goals was to create a character and game that would appeal to a worldwide audience, and specific focus group testing was conducted to ensure that Sonic would in fact appeal to the American game-playing public. As history proved out, Sega totally hit the mark with that one, but the company didn't want to rest on their laurels, which is what prompted the creation of STI in 1990, where Sega figured they could combine an American-based staff with Japanese game veterans to create high-quality titles infused with American culture, rather than simply localizing Japanese-based games for international players. In the years immediately following its founding, STI would create a couple games using primarily American designers, without much, if any, support from Japanese game developers, as Sega had faced issues with getting work visas approved for their Japanese staff to travel to America. At the same time, Sega of Japan was experiencing some staff turnover in key positions, most notably the departure of Yuji Naka from the company, who believed that he didn't receive the credit or recognition that he deserved as a result of the original Sonic the Hedgehog's success. As 1992 rolled around though, Sega was able to resolve those visa-related issues, which meant they could now begin sending Japanese staff over to America to work hand in hand with STI to begin creating future titles. And coincidentally, 1992 was also the time when Yuji Naka began looking for his next job, which incidentally would end up being a direct hire into the Sega Technical Institute by the company's leader, Mark Cerny. When Naka joined STI, he received a significant pay increase from his prior role with Sega, and was promised he would have more creative freedom than he previously enjoyed, both of which sounded pretty darn great to Naka. Unbeknownst to him, though, a large chunk of the previous Sonic team had been assigned to travel to America to work with STI as well. So with Naka and that group both joining STI in 1992, it was only natural that the company would be entrusted with the creation of one of the biggest sequels of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. With a team composed of both American and Japanese video game design talent, work on Sonic the Hedgehog 2 officially got underway, and pretty quickly became an incredibly contentious project, with constant strife and animosity between the American and Japanese staff, driven primarily by the language and cultural divide that existed within the team. In particular, Yuji Naka was irate, and would spend most of his time developing Sonic 2 being disgruntled and angry, prompting other members of the American team to label him, in their words, as an arrogant ass. Sonic 2 would eventually release in late 1992 to critical and commercial success, but that success came about almost in spite of its development cycle rather than because of it. It's not often when a contentious and volatile work environment results in a successful product release, but in this instance, the sheer talent of the combined team outweighed the contention between the Japanese and American staff. That experience, however, was enough for Naka to declare that he would never work with the American staff again. So, following the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, STI would be split into two separate teams. One featuring an entirely American development team, with the other staffed entirely by Japanese game designers and developers. The figurative divide within the team during Sonic 2's creation became a literal divide moving forward, as the two teams, despite working side by side, would never have any desire to work with each other, even though they were all physically in the same workspace. The Japanese development team would go off to work on both Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, while the American staff would end up working on the Sonic spin-off title Sonic Spinball, which owes its existence to the fact that Sonic 3 ended up being delayed, and Sega needed a Sonic title to fill the gap while the Japanese team kept working on the true sequel to Sonic 2. To help address the delay, a relatively new game designer was added to the Sonic 3 team, that being Takashi Iizuka, who quickly came up to speed and began working on the title, joining forces with Naka and the rest of the Sonic 3 Japanese staff to eventually bring that game, as well as its pseudo-sequel, but mostly add-on title Sonic & Knuckles, to market. While all of these Sonic-related shenanigans were happening in America, a related effort was happening in Japan, where original Sonic character artist Naoto Oshima had been tasked with directing a brand new Sonic game for the Genesis add-on peripheral, the Sega CD. The thought inside the company was, the Sega CD was a pretty cool piece of technology, but a huge chunk of the Sega CD library had less interactive experiences, like full-motion video titles, than other traditional cartridge-based consoles. As you all know, I love my Sega CD, primarily because of its full-motion video titles, but I can understand what Sega was thinking here. They believed they needed a game that could act as a system seller, and in much the same way as Nintendo routinely went to Mario as the killer game for any new console, Sega wanted to do the same thing for Sonic, which is why Naoto Oshima was given director responsibilities for the Sonic title that would eventually become Sonic CD. While a full discussion on the creation of all of these Sonic titles is beyond the scope of this episode, the key takeaway here is that there were multiple Sonic efforts happening in and around the same time, all of which, in some capacity, were helping to keep Sonic and Sega on the forefront of everyone's mind. But, as is often the case, changes were on the horizon. The video game industry began to shift as the mid-90s approached, driven primarily by the fact that newer technologies like three-dimensional graphics and CD-ROM storage devices were allowing for brand new gaming experiences, and all of the major video game console makers of the time, as well as several new entrants, were in the process of creating the next generation of home video game systems. You had Nintendo with their forthcoming Silicon Graphics-powered Nintendo 64. You had Sony, who was just entering the market with their new PlayStation console after being jilted at the altar by Nintendo during the whole "we need a Super Nintendo CD add-on" phase of Nintendo's 16-bit years. You had the 3DO and its drive to try to make a technology platform that any manufacturer could adopt, if they chose to pay the licensing fee. You even had Atari coming back into the market with their Jaguar console, which was probably a mistake, but regardless, perhaps more so than any other point in video game history, the mid-90s was ripe for experimentation, and technological advancement was happening at an increasingly rapid pace. Not to be left out, Sega was also working on their own version of the next generation of video game consoles, only here, the company was having a bit of an identity crisis. As we've discussed in prior podcast episodes, Sega's gaming aspirations ran the gamut from arcade-based hardware and games to home-based consoles, and the company oftentimes tried to use work on the former to help inform the latter. We saw this very clearly with the Sega Genesis console, whose internal hardware was based on the venerable System 16 arcade board that Sega used for a good portion of their mid to late 80s arcade hits. In response to that homification of Sega's arcade hardware, the arcade development group in the company began creating even more powerful arcade hardware, like the Model 1 arcade system in 1992, which was the first Sega arcade board to focus primarily on three-dimensional graphics, once again giving arcade titles a leg up over their home console brethren. At least for a little bit. Because, like I mentioned a minute ago, the next generation of consoles was destined to challenge arcades once again, as more advanced technology began to be integrated into those forthcoming home consoles. So, Sega decided to do something similar to what they had done with the Sega Genesis, in that they took a popular arcade technology, this time the 3D-based Model 1 arcade system, and tweaked it to be used in a home console, albeit with a revised system architecture as opposed to a true miniaturization of the real arcade hardware. This revised system architecture would form the basis of not one, but two home hardware products from Sega's console division. One was the 32X, a Genesis add-on that was intended to be a cheaper way of getting into the next generation of gaming. The other was a true standalone next-generation home console, which would evolve into the system we now know as the Sega Saturn. Interestingly, despite the fact that 3D technology was on the horizon, the console itself was not being designed with 3D as a singular focus. Instead, it was intended to primarily run two-dimensional arcade-like experiences, while still providing some 3D capabilities to support the newer collection of Model 1-based games that had recently been introduced in arcades, like Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing. To deliver these capabilities, Sega engineers decided on creating a dual-chip style of architecture, which basically meant that Saturn titles would be designed to run on two processors concurrently. Now, you might think that adding an additional processor would simply double your performance, only here you would be wrong. The thing is, whenever you begin trying to execute software using multiple processors or threads or processor cores or any other technology that runs instructions in parallel, you need a way to keep all of the concurrently running operations in sync. Otherwise, as I learned during a college course on operating system development, bad things can happen. In order to truly take advantage of a multiple processor kind of system architecture, the software you're coding needs to be designed explicitly to exploit that concurrency. So you might think, well, okay, just design your software like that and boom, you're done. Only here, I would urge you to recall that the Saturn was being created in the early 90s, when concepts like multiple core CPUs and hyperthreading weren't really a thing yet. Today, almost every piece of software is designed using concurrent programming techniques, but that was certainly not the case in 1992 when the Saturn was being designed. This meant two things. One, that the Saturn's architecture was actually more advanced than most other consoles of the time, and two, making games for the Saturn was going to be more complex than making games for other consoles, because of the complexity of the underlying architecture. Despite that complexity, and despite reluctance on the part of Sega of America leadership, Sega of Japan continued to design and develop the hardware for the console, figuring that if they delivered a highly advanced game system, the developers would figure out how to create good titles for it. Work on the Saturn continued, until one day, the team received some troubling news. Early reports on Sony's forthcoming PlayStation console suggested that the PlayStation had even more advanced capabilities than the Saturn, despite a much simpler architecture. Not wanting to be outdone, Sega went back to the drawing board and tweaked their system, adding an additional video display processor to the Saturn's already complex architecture, in the hopes of increasing the console's 2D and 3D performance to remain competitive with Sony's PlayStation system. Sega of America, under the leadership of then CEO Tom Kalinske, really disagreed with this approach, and they pushed back on this complex architectural design throughout the Saturn's design and production cycle, creating a little bit of contention between the American and Japanese divisions of the company. Though interestingly, Kalinske did try to make a peace offering of sorts, as he was able to broker a deal with Silicon Graphics to provide a video processing chip for the Saturn, which, like I mentioned, was the same company that would eventually provide the graphics processing subsystem for the Nintendo 64. Kalinske, along with others, believed that Silicon Graphics was the graphics technology leader in the industry at the time, and he figured if the Saturn's architecture needed to be made even more complex, at least Sega could put in a chip from the industry leader to give them an advantage over their competition. He brought that proposal to Sega of Japan leadership and was quickly shot down, creating yet another bone of contention between the two organizations, and ultimately leading to Silicon Graphics pursuing a partnership with Nintendo. Anyway, as is the case with every new console release, the power of the hardware is insignificant if the accompanying software, the games, aren't good enough experiences to attract and wow players. And here, Sega realized that they needed to make a strong impression out of the gate, and they needed to get their best and brightest talent to begin working on titles for the new system. So, they decided to contact several past and present members of Sonic Team, the creative force behind Sonic the Hedgehog, to take on a new assignment. This included Yuji Naka, who returned to Japan after his stint with STI to become a producer for the forthcoming title, along with Takashi Iizuka, Naka's partner in crime during Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles development, who would become the new game's designer. Rounding out the creative leaders on the team would be Naoto Oshima, the original artist behind Sonic the Hedgehog, who had brought Sonic CD to life, and was asked to assume director responsibilities for this new venture. Together, Naka, Oshima, and Iizuka would form the foundation of the team that would be tasked with creating the game that would eventually be known as Nights into Dreams. Interestingly, the concept for Nights, where players would explore fantastical dreamscapes and thwart their own nightmares, was something that originally was proposed during the development of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. But because all work was focused squarely on that title, followed by additional Sonic sequels, any other potential work would need to wait. After the release of Sonic & Knuckles, pretty much everyone in Sonic Team agreed that they wanted to try to work on something other than a Sonic game. So the fact that they were asked to create a unique, brand new game for Sega's newest home console, the Saturn, was an opportunity they all leapt for. As the team began working on the title, each member of the creative team sat down to do what they typically did best. Oshima, always a talented artist, designed the character art for Nights itself, which was intended to be androgynous in nature, representing the fact that Nights was a part of every human, and as such was effectively genderless. Oshima would continue refining this character design, using influences from various cultures to create a character that would, hopefully, have universal appeal around the world. Naka, being the genius programmer who introduced the world to Sonic's breakneck speed, began working on the game's engine and underlying mechanics. Only this time, Naka had a vision for the title that involved players flying through levels, albeit at a much slower pace than prior Sonic titles, while still using a traditional, for the time, two-dimensional side-scrolling perspective. This was a style of game that Sonic Team was familiar with, considering their prior efforts on the Sonic franchise. Sure, Nights might be a slower-paced game than Sonic's super-fast gameplay, but two-dimensional platforming? That was something the team knew how to do well. But the Saturn wasn't designed to be a system that could simply deliver the same kinds of experiences that came before. It was intended to represent the future of Sega's home video game pursuits. So it didn't take long before a proposal came to the team, requesting that they make Nights a 3D rather than 2D title. This would come with a bunch of added complexity, as not only had the team never worked on a 3D game before, but around the time of Nights' creation, hardly anyone across the entire industry had ever worked on a 3D game before. The use of 3D in games was rapidly expanding, but it was still far from the norm, and making NiGHTS as a 3D title was definitely something the team believed was a risky endeavor. Further, there was concern by Naka himself that creating three-dimensional characters using polygons rather than two-dimensional characters using sprites would result in less appealing visuals and could potentially limit the team's ability to create characters with the expressiveness that players were used to with prior Sonic titles. Despite those risks, the team decided to move forward with a 3D version of the title, requiring Naka to rework the game's engine to incorporate 3D characters, artwork, and environments, while gradually over time increasing the speed of gameplay to make the game feel more engaging to play. Interestingly, the very first implementation of the 3D version of NiGHTS presented an entirely 3D world for players to navigate, without any significant restrictions as to where players could go. If you could see it, you could navigate towards it. But, as was the case with many early 3D titles, actually navigating in a 3D space and the controls required to perform that navigation were not straightforward at all, and during testing, players would routinely complain that the game was very difficult to control, and ultimately wasn't really all that fun. This was a problem for several reasons, the most prominent of which was the fact that the game was being designed to be able to be beaten by young children, a demographic whose tolerance for frustration is, in a word, non-existent. The team knew a change needed to happen, so Naka went back and refined the game's mechanics, creating a series of invisible two-dimensional tracks that players could fly on, while weaving those tracks through the three-dimensional environments already created for the game, creating the sensation of moving through a 3D space while at the same time restricting players' controls to utilize a mostly two-dimensional control scheme. This process, while simple in theory, was very difficult to implement, and levels were remade multiple times over the period of the game's development, simply because the team was trying to figure out how to work in 3D, while at the same time trying to create a game that could show off the power of the Sega Saturn, and potentially help sell the system itself. The overall design of the title would fall to Takashi Iizuka, who worked tirelessly to bring all of the various pieces of the game together into a collective whole. Between the 3D environments, 2D movement and control schemes, and computer graphics-based cutscenes, Iizuka had his work cut out for him. And that's not even mentioning the game's sound design, which had to be worked on exclusively in the evening because Sonic Team's office wasn't soundproof. And if they worked during the day, they would be disturbing other Sega team members who were hard at work on their own titles. Obviously, this was not really an ideal situation for anyone working on the sound for the game. But because of the team's dedication, they continued to perform their work undeterred and without complaint. Other than the evening sound design sessions, there was something else that wasn't ideal about the game, and that was the fact that the traditional Saturn gamepad was designed for two-dimensional movement, and according to Iizuka, trying to translate a two-dimensional control scheme into a 3D space, even with restricted 3D navigation, just didn't feel right. So, the team decided to do something truly unique, in that they ended up creating a brand new controller that would be packaged with the game. This peripheral, which would be released as the Saturn 3D controller, featured an analog stick and triggers, in addition to traditional face buttons and a digital directional pad, in an attempt to match some of the same capabilities of the Nintendo 64's controller design. The team believed that this style of controller would better allow players to navigate the three-dimensional environments in the game, and would ultimately make the game be more fun for players. Across a number of revisions and taking feedback from one very high-profile test subject in famous Hollywood director Steven Spielberg, the team continued to refine the controller's design, eventually settling on a rounded controller body that they hoped would feel good in players' hands, while at the same time creating a new control scheme that the team believed would allow players to experience NiGHTS' unique gameplay and world in the best way possible. There was no guarantee of success, but the team was hopeful they would be successful. Eventually, all of the various elements of the game, both from a software and hardware perspective, would come together, and NiGHTS Into Dreams would release on the Sega Saturn in July of 1996. Almost immediately, the game received significant critical praise, with many declaring the game's graphics, gameplay, music, and overall flight mechanics to be a true harbinger of the next generation of video games, and something that players had never seen or experienced before. Multiple publications claimed that the game's flight controls and sensation of speed was better than most fully dedicated flight simulator titles, and as the year went on, numerous critics and news outlets would declare NiGHTS to be one of the best games of the year. This love for the game continued to grow even beyond the first year of its release, with NiGHTS being named by many as one of the best games ever created, with players and critics alike agreeing that the game was truly something special to behold. Despite the awards and accolades that NiGHTS received, there were some critics who honed in on some graphical inconsistencies and claimed, somewhat correctly, that the Sega Saturn was simply not powerful enough to run NiGHTS the way it was meant to be experienced. Like we talked about, developing anything for the Sega Saturn, let alone a revolutionary and brand new 3D title, was an incredibly challenging experience because of the complexity of the system's hardware architecture. And because NiGHTS was being designed using true 3D graphics and gameplay mechanics, the team couldn't simply reuse some of the pre-created code and graphics routines that Sega had created to make it easier for developers to make games for the system. Instead, the NiGHTS team needed to write their own graphics and gameplay routines for the game, which gave them complete control over how they implemented the various design ideas that made up the title, but in the process also made it so that some of their work was kinda experimental, and as such, may have had some bugs or anomalies that certain critics picked up on. Regardless, the fact is that NiGHTS Into Dreams was a nearly universally acclaimed title, and would go on to both sell well and remain in gamers' collective memories for years following its release. Its popularity would spawn a Christmas-themed release later in 1996 entitled Christmas Nights, which, by the way, was simply awesome, along with a number of remakes, and in 2007, a full-on sequel for the Nintendo Wii. The game's characters would make cameo appearances in other games over the years, and would even spawn a comic book miniseries which, unfortunately, did not sell well enough to justify any sort of continued investment. It's unclear if a third NiGHTS game will ever make its way to market, but Takashi Iizuka, for his part, did indicate that he'd be open to creating a third NiGHTS game if given the opportunity. That comment was made almost 14 years ago at this point, so it certainly seems like there isn't much happening in that regard. Still, it is nice to know that another sequel was, at least at some point, a consideration. The influential members behind the creation of NiGHTS Into Dreams would all continue to have fairly impressive careers in the video game industry, working on a number of titles for Sega's next console, the Dreamcast, as well as other Sega-created titles that would appear on non-Sega systems, as Sega began to distance itself from the console hardware market. The Saturn would end up being a commercial failure for Sega, owing largely to the difficulty in creating quality titles for the system, coupled with a higher price tag than other comparable systems with decidedly larger software libraries. While Sega would rebound a bit with the Dreamcast, which is honestly one of my favorite systems of all time, it would end up being far too little, too late, and Sega would exit the console hardware space entirely after its Dreamcast production lines were shut down. Despite the failure of the Saturn as a console, the simple fact is that NiGHTS Into Dreams was undeniably one of the shining stars of the Saturn's game library, and anyone who has played the game likely shares that belief. With NiGHTS, a talented team of designers and developers succeeded in delivering an experience that was unlike anything players had experienced before, and even though it would never reach the franchise status of its speedier ancestor, Sonic the Hedgehog, that in no way diminishes the quality of NiGHTS as a standalone title. While nobody knows if a new NiGHTS adventure will ever fly across our collective screens in the future, the original title remains a beloved game in its own right, and as such, is definitely a game that will likely be remembered by all who have played it fondly for countless years to come. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Nights into Dreams today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. So Nights, in its most basic form, is a three-dimensional action title that presents players with a series of worlds in which to navigate, collecting items along the way, before eventually making your way to a boss fight in order to progress to the next stage. That description, while accurate, in no way captures the uniqueness that is Nights, and I've got to say, in all sincerity, that Nights is so distinct that it is pretty much unlike any other game I've ever played. So let's talk about the overall structure of Nights, and what makes it such a unique experience. The game revolves around two young children, a boy named Elliot and a girl named Clarice, both of whom have the ability to actively interact with the dreams and nightmares that they have each time when they go to sleep at night. And it is in this dream world, which the game calls NiGHTopia, that you'll spend the majority of your time playing the game. There are 7 distinct dream worlds that you'll make your way through as you play the game, with 3 unique worlds assigned to Elliot and Clarice each, and a final shared world that is effectively the same regardless of which character you've chosen. The core concept behind the game is that you have to navigate these dream worlds, complete the challenges contained within each one, and finally defeat the evil nightmare ruling over that particular dream. Assuming you beat the nightmare, the game unlocks the next dream for your chosen character. If you fail, then the next dream world remains locked, and you have to start your current dream all over again. Each dream that you'll encounter in the game is designed as a full 3-dimensional world, though I would be hesitant to call any of them quote-unquote open worlds. When you first enter a dream, you begin as your chosen character, whose abilities are limited to running and jumping. Shortly after you enter a dream, though, a bunch of monsters come by and steal 4 dream orbs from you, each of which is imprisoned by a different monster machine located throughout the dream world. It is your job to retrieve those 4 orbs, after which you can confront the big bad nightmare monster of that particular dream. Interestingly, while you can technically navigate the dream world on foot as your chosen character, the real way you'll gather points and retrieve your stolen orbs is by stepping onto a platform of sorts upon which lives Nights, a denizen of the dream world and someone who you can then control to more effectively address the challenges contained in each dream. Rather than being restricted to only running and jumping, Nights is able to fly through the game world, performing various acrobatic feats as you navigate around whatever dream you're in, defeating enemies, gathering orbs and stars, and ultimately retrieving the orbs that had been stolen from you after entering the dream world. Moving around as Nights is probably the most unique aspect of the game, as the majority of your time will be spent moving left and right in what ends up being a sort of rotational motion around the game world. Meaning, rather than have the ability to navigate in all directions in the game world, you simply move either left or right, which in turn navigates you in a revolution around the game world and the various courses that make up each dream sequence. Speaking of those courses, each dream is split up into 4 distinct paths, each of which has a different set of paths and obstacles that you'll need to navigate. The goal in each course is to collect 20 spheres, after which you need to find the nightmare machine that is holding one of your dream orbs and, using those 20 collected spheres, defeat it. To do that, you simply enter the nightmare machine, after which the game displays a countdown showing how many spheres you've collected so far. If you have 20 or more, the nightmare machine explodes, you retrieve your dream orb, and you now have to return to Night's platform in order to complete the course and move on to the next one. If you have less than 20, then the machine simply spits you back out and you go back to work to collect the remaining spheres that you need to make it to that threshold 20 value. Assuming you do defeat the nightmare machine and retrieve your dream orb, you now have a decision to make. Each course in the game is designed with a concrete time limit in mind, and you as a character don't have a life bar per se. But what you do have is that time limit, which is what serves as the main way the game designates success or failure of a given course. The overall goal in each course is to defeat the nightmare machine, retrieve your dream orb, and return to Night's platform before the time limit elapses. If you fail to get back to the platform before the countdown clock runs out, then you'll shift back into your normal character and lose every single item and collectible you picked up along the way, which will reset your point total to 0 for that specific course. Luckily, the game does allow you to return to the platform even in human form, which can continue the game assuming you get back there while avoiding enemies. And even if you return to the platform without any items, as long as you collected your dream orb, you can continue progressing through the game. So you might be wondering, What is the purpose then of collecting items and generating points if the game will simply allow you to progress regardless of if you have 10,000, 100,000, or 0 points? Well, it turns out that when you complete a course in a given dream, the game will give you a ranking, anywhere from A to F, and upon completing all courses and nightmares in a dream, you'll get an overall dream ranking, once again from A to F. Beyond the desire to get higher ranks and point totals for bragging rights, the game limits your ability to play the final level in the game based on your performance across the first 3 dreams for each character. To illustrate that, let's go over an example. Assume you're playing as Elliot, and you complete the 3 unique dreams assigned to him. If you completed all of those dreams with a ranking of C or higher, then you will unlock the final shared stage, which is required to actually beat the game. If, however, you did not achieve a C ranking or higher across all 3 of those dreams, then the final dream remains locked. Now, I know when I first started playing Nights in preparation for this episode, I was a bit confused about how to get higher ranks on each of the dreams and the courses within those dreams. I would complete each course in record time, racing around to acquire 20 spheres, defeat the Nightmare Machine, and then make my way back to Night's platform, and each time I did that, I'd routinely get a D or worse. I recognized that higher points would equate to higher rankings, but I assumed that the goal was to complete courses as quickly as possible in order to maximize my rating. Well, it turns out that is not the case, as rating is tied solely to your score, and the only way to raise your score is to collect spheres and stars, fly through rings, and defeat enemies. Logically, you might think that speed would factor into the rankings, but that's just not the way the game works at all. So, the way you really get those higher rankings is by simply doing things that increase your score, and here the game introduces a degree of risk versus reward. Like I mentioned, each course in the dream you're playing has a time limit, and you need to return to Night's platform before time elapses in order to capture points. Otherwise, you'll almost certainly be ranked as an F for that particular course. Well, since the only way to get a higher score is to perform actions in that course, you actually need to fly through that course multiple times to accumulate as high of a score as you can before you go back to Night's platform. Luckily, the game resets the course's collectibles each time you complete a lap, so you can continue to gain points as long as you have time left on the clock. What you have to be careful of, though, is making sure you collect enough points for a high ranking, while at the same time managing time effectively enough that you can in fact return to Night's platform with all of those hard-earned points before running out of time. I will admit, I pushed things a bit too far a few times, and I ended up with an F despite all of my best efforts. This is definitely an interesting gameplay mechanic, and the feeling of racing back to the platform with a ton of points as the clock counts down is one of the more exciting scenarios that you'll encounter in the game. If all you had to do was return to Night's platform without any impediments, though, things wouldn't be too bad. But you also have to deal with enemies throughout each dream, some of which grab you and prevent you from moving, while others have spiky appendages that, if they hit you, will take a chunk of time off of your countdown timer. This can be especially dangerous, as you might be racing back to Night's platform with a ton of points and only a few seconds left, only to smack into an unseen enemy and have it eat the rest of your time, thereby returning you to human form with 0 points to your name. This can be irritating when it happens, but whenever it does happen, the irritation is squarely the fault of the player, as the game is designed surprisingly fairly throughout most of your playthrough. Luckily, the game does give you several ways of defeating enemies. You can either fly at high speed into them, effectively performing a flying headbutt, or more interestingly, you can complete a loop around an enemy, which also defeats bad guys outright. This loop mechanic is something that you'll end up using in a variety of situations, including defeating enemies, gathering items, and performing acrobatic tricks to gain even more points. And while the first few times you try to navigate levels might feel a bit chaotic, you'll eventually figure out the best way to control your speed, momentum, and acrobatic ability to be able to deftly fly around each level, defeating and avoiding enemies as you see fit, en route to the confrontation with that dream's nightmare boss. And speaking of those nightmare bosses, each dream has one, and they are all distinct encounters, aside from the final stage, which, like we talked about, is a direct copy that applies the same level and encounter to both Elliot and Clarice. These nightmare fights are supposed to be the culmination of your experience in a given dream, and each encounter employs unique mechanics and requirements in order to defeat the boss. From my perspective, this is one of the areas where the game falters just a little bit. While some of the bosses and boss stages are pretty straightforward in terms of figuring out what needs to be done, a good chunk of them are a bit difficult to figure out, which can lead to some frustration as you try to discover what you need to do to actually beat the nightmare you're fighting. And the primary cause of that frustration is that if you die to a boss, or more accurately run out of time, you will have to restart the entire dream you were just on, regardless of how well you performed in that dream. You may have been a straight A flyer, but failed at that boss, and it doesn't even matter. For its part, the game does give you a hint after you fail at a given boss, and most of those hints are pretty useful, especially if you weren't sure how to tackle a boss in the first place. There is one boss, however, whose hint isn't even all that clear, and I gotta say, I was pretty frustrated with that one. I won't spoil the encounter or the way to actually beat the boss, but suffice it to say, the clue suggests that you should attack a certain item when, in reality, the solution is much, much simpler. Once I figured out the real way to tackle the boss, I was able to beat it on the very next try, but getting there, that was a bit of an experience. Assuming you do beat the boss, you'll be given a score multiplier based on how much time is left on the clock, ranging between 1.0 and 2.0. Obviously, your goal should be to get as close to 2.0 as possible, as that'll be multiplied with your total dream score to get your final total, which is then what ends up being used as the final rank for that dream. Like I said earlier, if you get a C or higher, then you're all set. If not, you'll need to repeat the dream at some point, otherwise you won't be able to make your way to the final stage and boss. What we just talked about is effectively the core framework for the game, though there are some additional features utilized in different dreams that serve to mix up the gameplay a bit. Like we talked about, dream worlds generally involve side-to-side navigation where you effectively circumnavigate a given level, completing laps of courses in the process. Well, there are also some different sections of courses that utilize unique mechanics, which can range from a top-down viewpoint, which from my perspective was trickier than I expected to navigate, as well as a behind-the-shoulder perspective, where you're flying into the screen as opposed to navigating side to side. These special course sections were a welcome change of pace, as they helped to increase the gameplay diversity in each dream world, and at the same time, showcase the fact that even though you normally only move left to right, you are in fact navigating a fully realized three-dimensional world. One final feature included in a number of dreams is a special acrobatics ring, where, assuming you pass through it, you'll begin flying around with a stream of light behind you. When this happens, your main goal is to complete as many acrobatic maneuvers as possible, which might be as simple as making loops of varying sizes, or if you want to get fancy, you can use your shoulder buttons to perform various moves to mix things up. This is more of a diversion than a core gameplay mechanic, but it is one I enjoyed each time I had the opportunity to experience it. Hopefully, I've been able to make it clear that there are a lot of interesting design features included in NiGHTS that truly does make it a unique experience that defies direct comparison with more traditional titles. We'll continue to talk about that uniqueness and the more specific aspects of the game in just a minute, but first, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially back around the era of the games that we normally look at, where the internet wasn't really a thing, or at least it wasn't a pervasive thing yet. We didn't have YouTube to look up gameplay videos. All we really had were magazine review articles, word of mouth, and what the box looked like in the store. If the front of the box looked cool, we'd pick it up. We'd flip it over. If the back of the box made it sound intriguing, we might purchase the game. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for NiGHTS Into Dreams for the Sega Saturn, the back of the box says, NiGHTS Into Dreams. Immerse yourself in an unparalleled 3D flying experience. NiGHTS delivers a truly amazing virtual world of dreams, filled with unbelievable real-time effects, fantastic creatures, and nightmarish monsters. A masterful showcase of Sega Saturn's raging processing power. Face your worst nightmares in a stunning world of 3D gameplay. Dozens of camera angles, never seen before effects, and 3D positional sound. Developed exclusively for Sega Saturn by the creators of Sonic the Hedgehog. And then there are a few screenshots on the back of the box, along with a little comment from Next Generation magazine back in July of 1996 that says, "The most revolutionary 32-bit game yet." So that's the back of the box for NiGHTS, and I've got to say, it mostly sold me on the title. Back when it first came out, it absolutely sold me because it looked amazing, and it was a game for the Saturn, which was a system that I didn't have a ton of games for, but I had enough, and this one looked really good. Even looking at the back of the box today, the graphics look really good for an earlier 3D title, and we'll talk more about that in a second. The marketing speak, the bullets and all that kind of stuff, I don't know. I feel like they could have done a little bit of a better job actually marketing the title a little bit on the back of the box. It might just be my mood today, but I feel like there's something missing there. I can't put my finger on exactly what it is, but I do feel like there was a way they could have made it more compelling. Still, not a bad back of the box, and it was certainly good enough for me back in 1996 because I did in fact buy it when it came out. So we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. NiGHTS is one of the most colorful 3D games that I've played in recent memory, with visuals that pop off the screen and create an experience that can best be described as a feast for the eyes. You know how a lot of early 3D games were marked by technically proficient graphics but mostly drab visuals? Or perhaps a better way to say it is, early 3D titles were more focused on pushing polygons as opposed to presenting colorful gameplay? Well, you don't have that issue with NiGHTS at all, as every single scene, every dream world, every character, literally everything in the game featured an explosion of colors, and my eyes loved every moment that I spent playing the title. From a more technical perspective, while the game is beautifully colorful, the character and environment structures are all decidedly mid-90s era design, with blocky visuals where you can pretty much see how each individual object was composed of the polygons that made up those objects. This isn't from the era of gaming where smooth visuals for 3D titles were the norm, so it's not surprising that every scene in the game had very visible polygon surfaces. The sheer propensity of color goes a long way to minimizing the obvious polygon construction of various objects, but if you take a more critical eye, you can definitely tell this is an older title. There are also some cutscenes that play at the beginning of the game if you leave the title screen to idle for a period of time, as well as at the end of the game after you beat the final stage, and these cutscenes all look exactly like what you would expect a mid-90s pre-rendered cutscene to look like, with stylized character designs and exaggerated, almost to the point of caricature, models, and some compression artifacts that just scream, "We needed to fit this on a disc, so this is the best we could do." I honestly have no issue with these kinds of visuals, as I find them charming and, at least for me, are a nice jolt of nostalgia anytime I see 90s era pre-rendered 3D graphics. For anyone who doesn't have that same nostalgia and is looking solely at this from a more modern perspective, I will admit that the cutscenes look a bit rough. Not enough to distract from the rest of the game, but enough to warrant mentioning. Animations, meanwhile, are all universally excellent, and in particular, the smoothness of moving through each dream world is quickly apparent as soon as you start playing the game. Everything on the screen refreshes at a pretty quick pace, with only certain scenes featuring some graphics pop-in, which usually happens when the scene changes perspective from the traditional side view to a more behind-the-character viewpoint. This is never distracting, but it is something I noted as I played through the game. The only other aspect of the visuals that I want to mention is the camera that the game uses when exploring dream worlds on foot in human form. In short, it's not great, and if the entire game were designed as an on-foot experience, there's a very real chance that this would have been critically panned, as it is infuriatingly difficult to figure out where to go when you're in human form. Even with an arrow pointing you in the right direction, I felt completely disoriented a good portion of the time, owing largely to the fact that the camera maintains a strange viewing angle that, despite being able to be rotated using the shoulder buttons on your controller, never really feels like it shows you enough of the game world to be an effective means of actually playing the game. Luckily, the majority of the game is spent controlling NiGHTS, and the camera that's used during those sequences is light years better than the on-foot camera. Overall, the visuals for NiGHTS look really good, and other than a couple of minor critiques, this is one good-looking mid-90s game. Moving on to the sound and music, for the most part, I really enjoyed the music across the entire game, with stage music sounding nicely whimsical and arcadey, for lack of a better term, and each and every melody being something that you can tell the musicians behind the title polished to a near perfect shine. I don't know that I would call any tracks particularly memorable, aside from the main theme, which we will definitely talk about in a minute, but regardless, the music was really well done, and from my perspective, perfectly matches the game's story of traversing a series of dreamscapes in a fantastical Wonderland-like environment. Sound effects are similarly high quality, though really nothing to draw attention to. They fit the action on the screen, and they work just fine. What I do want to talk about, though, is the main theme song for the game, which primarily plays over the end credits after you beat the final boss. I am incredibly divided on this one, because on one hand, the theme itself is pretty darn catchy, and I found myself humming the tune at various points throughout the day as I went about my normal chores, so I know the song is good. But the vocals? I don't know. Look, I hate to be overly critical of something that was obviously constructed with care and attention, because when someone does something and truly devotes themselves to it, they deserve respect. But the vocals? To my ears, the actual singing during the theme sounded really pitchy and amateur, and my first thought when listening to the song after I beat the game was, did the composer have their daughter sing the song? I don't mean that disrespectfully, and it's entirely possible that anyone's daughter might be a really good singer. I mean this from the perspective of parental bias, where parents typically think their offspring are capable of anything, and everything they do is perfection. I know I fall into this trap myself, so I'm not faulting if this is what actually happened. I'm just saying that from an outsider listening in, the vocals during the ending credits were a different level of quality than the rest of the musical experience, which, like I said, were really well done, and in some instances even approached Disney levels of whimsy. Overall, the audio was great. It's just that one aspect of the soundtrack that is questionable to me. Moving on to the narrative and story, looking at the story for NiGHTS, it becomes fairly apparent that the writers are either some of the more imaginative people living, or may have had pharmaceutical assistance when composing the game's narrative. Hold on to your hats, because this has more backstory than it has any right having. In the world of NiGHTS, every human dream, every single evening, plays out in one of two lands. Normal dreams take place in a realm called NiGHTopia, where anything can happen and whimsy and fancy rule the land. Nightmares, by contrast, occur in a land called, literally, Nightmare, where scary creatures that represent the dreamer's fears, anxieties, and neuroses live. When a dreamer is inhabiting NiGHTopia, he or she is surrounded by a series of colored orbs called ideias, each of which represents an aspect of the dreamer's personality. These orbs are filled with dream energy, and the evil ruler of the Nightmare Land, Wiseman the Wicked, is on a quest to capture these orbs and the energy contained therein so that he can become more powerful, escape from Nightmare, invade and conquer NiGHTopia, and eventually take over the entire real world. As part of his plan, Wiseman creates a series of boss-level henchmen called Nightmaren, as well as a couple of lower-level henchmen, one of which is the titular character NiGHTS. NiGHTS recognizes that Wiseman is not all that wise, and is in fact evil, so he decides to rebel against the big bad ruler. This discretion, however, hasn't gone unpunished, as Wiseman captured NiGHTS and imprisoned him in an Idea Palace, which is the aforementioned platform habitat that I've been referencing previously. At the same time as chaos is taking over Nightmare and NiGHTopia, two children, Elliot and Clarice, are dealing with their own challenges in the real world, both of whom experience some embarrassing situations that ultimately manifest themselves in their dreams, which of course are taking place in NiGHTopia. Only, as you might have guessed, Elliot and Clarice are not normal dreamers inhabiting NiGHTopia. No, they are in fact special, as they possess the idea representing carriage, which Wiseman apparently is unable to steal. Elliot and Clarice notice the imprisoned NiGHTS, and after releasing him, they learn about Wiseman's plot and resolve to work with NiGHTS to defeat the evil ruler and prevent him from carrying out his dastardly plans. Over a series of different dreams, Elliot, Clarice, and NiGHTS work together to defeat Wiseman's Nightmare and henchmen, recover stolen dream orbs, and, hopefully, banish wise men from Nightopia and the real world once and for all. Whew, that was a lot. And I've got to say, this was a crazy amount of story and lore for what at the end of the day is a fairly lightweight platforming-like title, albeit without any platforms. I appreciate the attention to detail, but also think the story is absolutely bonkers, which honestly kinda made me like it more. It's like someone said, take any idea you might have and add it to the story, and the people working on the game ended up doing exactly that. Even more bonkers is the fact that nearly none of this story is actually conveyed in-game, short of some cutscenes without dialogue that goes into the embarrassments that Claris and Elliot both faced. Otherwise, all of this lore and story is an out-of-game kind of thing, and while I enjoyed it, I really do think it was kinda crazy how much attention the team placed on the plot. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked about the general structure of the game, but what we didn't talk about too much is the overall control scheme for the title, which will vary a bit depending on what controller you end up using. NiGHTS was one of, if not the first Sega Saturn game to support the Saturn 3D controller, which added an analog stick and analog shoulder triggers to the traditional Saturn controller, and in the process created an entirely new form factor for the Sega console ecosystem. When you play NiGHTS via emulation, you can actually choose which controller to emulate, either the traditional Sega Saturn digital pad or the 3D controller with its analog controls. From my perspective, the 3D controller is the way to go, and using that one makes the game feel surprisingly modern from a control perspective. The traditional D-pad can be used if you want, but I do think you lose a bit with the 3D navigation element of the title if you don't use the analog controls. That being said, regardless of what controller you use, everything other than movement is pretty much the same. In your human form, you can walk and run and jump, and that's pretty much it. While in NiGHTS form, you can fly around, activate a super speed move that lets you fly faster and crash more effectively into enemies and objects, and can perform a series of acrobatic maneuvers using the shoulder buttons on your controller. The acrobatic moves appear to have been included simply for fun, as there is little gameplay benefit, short of getting some points, to executing those maneuvers. The super speed move, by contrast, is a necessary maneuver, as it's one of the few ways you have of actually attacking enemies, with the other being the ability to loop around a bad guy to defeat it. The super speed move does have a limited power meter, which is refilled by collecting spheres and stars and, generally speaking, linking actions together. In this context, an action might be collecting one of the aforementioned items, defeating an enemy, or flying through a ring floating in the air, and the more of these actions you complete in sequence, the higher your link chain and the more power meter you can recover. Except for a single sequence in the game, I never really ran low on my super speed power meter, so as long as you're actively trying to maximize your score, you shouldn't really have any problem in maintaining that meter. The only other item to mention, at least as it relates to the game's controls, is that the controls are pretty darn tight, despite being a unique 3D-driven title. There is a lot to like about the overall controls and how it feels to play the game, and like I mentioned, everything feels surprisingly modern. Beyond the controls, the only other item we haven't yet talked about is the game's difficulty, and here I do have some thoughts. In prepping for this episode, I read a number of different reviews, both from the time in which the game was released, as well as from a more modern perspective. One common thread I found in many of the retrospective discussions was the claim that NiGHTS is an overly difficult experience, a game that is decidedly old school and isn't particularly friendly to players. And to that I say, sort of, but not really. Yes, there are some older design decisions, like the complete loss of all level progress if you end up running out of time or losing to a boss, and the requirement to achieve a certain ranking in each dream prior to unlocking the final boss can potentially be seen as increased difficulty. But honestly, as I played through the game, I didn't really feel like it was an unfair, brutally challenging experience. Were there some difficult sections? Sure, and the fact that some bosses are not exactly the easiest to figure out did make some losses sting a little bit. But overall, I just don't see it, and while NiGHTS might be more difficult than most modern titles, this is not anywhere near the level of difficulty of many classic titles. I respect anyone's opinion who feels this is too tough, but I don't personally agree. From my perspective, this is a really well-designed title, and one that feels more modern than you might expect. It is, for the most part, enjoyable from beginning to end. So overall, how did it feel to play NiGHTS? Well, I thought the game felt really good to play, with each aspect of the title coming together to make a unique, fun, and engaging experience. I've voiced some critiques already, but outside of those, everything else was pretty much exactly what I would want from an experimental mid-90s 3D title, and I loved it. So what is our verdict? Well, NiGHTS is unlike the majority of titles that I've played, and is certainly different than any of the titles I've played for this podcast. And the interesting thing here is that sometimes trying something different does not pay off. I mean, there's a reason why many popular games mimic each other. It works, and people, generally speaking, like consistency. With NiGHTS, you have something that defies simple categorization, and the thing is, every aspect of its experimental design works in concert with each other to create an experience that is insanely memorable, creatively whimsical, and deeply engaging. And because of that, as well as the comments I've already provided, NiGHTS Into Dreams has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. If you've slept on the title before, get it, now is a perfect opportunity to correct that oversight. It is undoubtedly a unique experience, and it's not without some issues, but overall, the good far outweighs the bad. And when taken as a whole, there is so much to like that most of my memories at this point are solely positive. I heartily recommend everyone play this game. I have no doubt that you'll find a bunch of stuff to like here. That was our episode on NiGHTS Into Dreams. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you about what's working and what might need some tweaks. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to deliver the content you all want to listen to, and I want to continue to make sure I am delivering the best possible podcast that I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.